General Washington stood at the center of the gallows, a lone figure against the sprawling, glimmering expanse of Arc Centauri's Grand Plaza. The city, capital of the Galactic Empire, pulsed with alien energy. Impossibly tall spires of glass and metal pierced the swirling crimson skies, their glowing tips humming in sync with the crowd's jeers. Thousands of alien faces, scaled, furred, feathered, and chitinous, gazed at him with hatred and cruel satisfaction. The plaza itself was a masterpiece of oppression, its polished black stone etched with murals of humanity's defeats, each one commemorating another step in their subjugation. The air was electric, not from Washington's impending execution, but from the spectacle it had become. Broadcast across the galaxy, his trial was meant to break humanity's spirit. Every word spoken by the alien prosecutor, every accusation levied, was carefully calibrated to humiliate not just him, but the billions of humans watching from every corner of the Empire's domain. Washington felt the weight of their eyes, even across light years. He straightened his broad shoulders, his battle-worn uniform clinging to him like a second skin. The seams were frayed, and its once proud insignia of Earth's military forces was faded, yet he wore it as if it were a crown. General Washington of Earth. The Arbiter's voice thundered, amplified by the plaza's vast sound array. The alien judge's towering form loomed above him, its shimmering scales reflecting the fiery light of the twin suns. Its voice, cold and mechanical, carried no emotion. You stand accused of orchestrating the deaths of over 7 billion imperial citizens, spreading sedition among enslaved species, and destabilizing the peace of the galaxy. Washington said nothing. He met the Arbiter's gleaming, lidless eyes with unflinching resolve, his jaw set like granite. Have you any words of remorse before your sentence is carried out? A ripple of anticipation passed through the crowd. Aliens leaned forward, eager to savor his humiliation. Cameras hovered around the gallows like predatory insects, broadcasting every detail of Washington's expression. He could almost feel the eyes of his people glued to their screens, their hearts heavy with despair. But despair was not what Washington intended to leave them with. His eyes scanned the sea of alien faces before him. He saw the contempt, the satisfaction, but beneath it, he caught something else. Something small, fleeting, but unmistakable. Fear. They feared him, even now, with his hands shackled and his body worn from weeks of imprisonment. It wasn't just fear of the man. It was fear of what he represented. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat as his gaze landed on a group of human slaves stationed near the edges of the plaza. Their gaunt faces were downcast, their postures hunched under the weight of servitude, yet their eyes, those who dared to look, betrayed a spark of defiance. The Arbiter cleared its throat, an unsettling sound like metal scraping against stone. Speak, human. Washington exhaled slowly, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He would speak, but not to beg. Remorse? His voice, deep and commanding, cut through the noise like a blade. The jeers quieted, the crowd leaning in. Even the Arbiter tilted its head slightly, intrigued. I feel no remorse, Washington said, his words deliberate and sharp. For too long, humanity knelt before you. For too long, we endured your chains, your cruelty, your lies. I do not regret the lives I took in the fight for freedom. And if I had the chance, I'd do it all again. The plaza erupted in outrage, alien voices screeching in a cacophony of rage. The Arbiter raised a hand, silencing the noise. You dare to stand here condemned and defy the Empire with such arrogance. Washington's smirk widened, but his eyes burned with intensity. Defiance is all I have left to give, and it's more powerful than anything you'll ever understand. Somewhere in the crowd, a small ripple of movement caught his attention. A slave, an older man with silvered hair and sunken cheeks, shifted slightly, his eyes locking with Washington's for a fleeting moment. The man's lips moved imperceptibly, forming words that Washington couldn't hear, but their meaning was clear. We are watching. We are waiting. Washington's pulse quickened. The plan was in motion. The Arbiter's mechanical voice crackled to life again. Enough. Your words mean nothing. Your rebellion has failed. Humanity's resistance is broken. And today, you will pay the ultimate price for your crimes. The executioner, a hulking, insectoid brute with mandibles glistening like sharpened knives, stepped forward. It gripped the lever that would release the trapdoor beneath Washington's feet. The crowd hushed, their anticipation almost tangible. Washington drew in a deep breath. He knew what was coming. He had prepared for it. But first, there was one last thing to say. He lifted his head, his voice ringing out with a clarity that seemed to shake the very air. To all who suffer under the Empire's boot, listen to me. They may kill me today, but they will never kill the idea of freedom. My death will not be the end. It will be the beginning. The Arbiter gestured impatiently to the executioner. But Washington wasn't done. Rise, he roared, his voice echoing through the plaza. Rise and show them that chains can be broken. Rise and take back what they stole from you. The executioner pulled the lever. Washington dropped. Gasps rippled through the crowd as his body fell. The sound of the rope snapping taut, cutting through the silence like a gunshot. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The jeering stopped. The plaza, the city, the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, far above the gallows, a faint shimmer disrupted the sky. A fleet of stealth ships began to emerge from the shadows, their outlines barely visible against the red haze of the twin suns. The human slaves in the crowd stirred, their gazes lifting, their chains rattling faintly as their hearts surged with hope. The executioner turned its head skyward, its mandibles clicking in confusion. The Arbiter's voice crackled urgently, issuing commands. The crowd erupted into chaos, their earlier triumph dissolving into panic. Washington's body hung still, his head bowed, but his words, those final, searing words, resonated in the minds of all who had heard them. And far away, across distant worlds, the seeds of rebellion began to sprout. The galaxy watched as General Washington's voice carried through the vast expanse of space, transmitted on every channel, to every corner of the Empire's dominion. His words were a spark, small at first but growing brighter with each syllable, igniting a flame that even the Galactic Empire could not extinguish. Across countless worlds, slaves and workers paused, their gazes turning skyward to the holographic broadcast that filled the air. In the cavernous mines of Titan's Gulch, a young human miner froze, her pickaxe slipping from her hands. On the distant jungle moon of Veda's Prime, a scaled alien overseer barked orders at its laborers, but they no longer listened. Even in the luxurious chambers of an imperial governor on Erythros, a clawed hand hovered over a glass of fine ambrosia, the speech breaking through layers of propaganda to pierce the listener's core. "This is not the end," Washington said, his voice rich with defiance. "You believe you've broken us. You think you've crushed humanity beneath your heel. But look at me now. Even here, with your noose around my neck, I stand taller than any of you, because I stand for something you'll never understand." The camera focused on Washington's face, his eyes burning with a fire that no chain or prison could dim. To many watching, he was more than a man. He was an idea made flesh, the embodiment of humanity's resilience. His weathered features told the story of countless battles, of victories hard won and losses deeply felt. But the set of his jaw, the unwavering steadiness of his voice, spoke of a determination that no empire could quench. On a freighter drifting near the imperial border, Captain Elias Trent leaned against a console, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The room around him was cramped, the walls lined with cables and blinking lights. But his focus was on the hologram of Washington projected before him. "Damn fool," Trent muttered under his breath, his lips curling into a wry smile. Only Washington could turn his own execution into a rallying cry. Behind him, Lieutenant Marcus Hales, younger and more impulsive, paced nervously. His wild red hair caught the dim glow of the console lights, his hands gesturing in sharp, frustrated motions. Are we just going to sit here and watch this? Hale snapped, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and desperation. We should be doing something. Trent didn't turn. His gaze stayed locked on Washington, studying every word, every movement. We are doing something, Lieutenant. We're waiting for the signal. Hale stopped pacing, his hands clenching into fists. The signal? What if there is no signal? What if they kill him? And that's it. Trent finally turned, his eyes narrowing. There's always a signal with Washington. You just have to know where to look for it. As if on cue, Washington's voice cut through the tension in the room. To those who watch in silence, afraid of what rebellion might cost, I tell you this. The cost of inaction is far greater. The Empire doesn't want peace. It wants control. It wants to strip you of your freedom, your dignity, your very identity, until there's nothing left but what they allow you to be. But you don't have to accept it. You don't have to kneel. The hologram flickered, briefly disrupted by interference. Trent's jaw tightened. He could sense the importance of what was coming, could feel it like a storm on the horizon. Back on Arc Centauri, the crowd grew restless. Some jeered louder, their voices straining to drown out Washington's defiance, while others fell silent, their expressions uneasy. The Arbiter's clawed fingers tapped against the edge of its podium, its cold gaze fixed on the human. It leaned forward slightly, its voice low and menacing. Enough, it said, though the word lacked the authority it intended. This spectacle is over. But Washington did not stop. You can kill me, he said, his voice rising. You can silence me. But my death will not end this fight. It will only fan the flames. Because freedom is not something you can chain. It's not something you can crush beneath your ships or bury in your minds. Freedom is alive, and it lives in all of us, human and alien alike. The Arbiter motioned to the executioner, its patience gone. The hulking, insectoid creature stepped forward, its mandibles clicking as it gripped the lever. But even as the crowd braced for the moment of Washington's death, his voice boomed one last time. And to those enslaved, those oppressed, I say this: rise, rise, and show them that we are more than they could ever imagine. Rise, and let them hear your defiance from the farthest reaches of the stars. Because today, we fight not just for survival. We fight for the right to be. In the mining colony of Titan's Gulch, the young woman who had dropped her pickaxe now raised it again, but not for work. She turned to the overseer, her face set with grim determination. Around her, others began to follow, their movements hesitant at first, but growing bolder. On Veda's prime, an alien labor, a massive, reptilian creature with dark, scarred scales, slowly stood upright. It towered over its overseer, its golden eyes glinting with newfound resolve. Others followed, their chains rattling as they moved. And on the freighter, Trent straightened, his eyes locked on the hologram as Washington's final words echoed in the room. That's it, Trent said softly, his voice steady. That's the signal. Hales blinked, his confusion giving way to understanding. You mean Operation Dawnfire? Trent confirmed, moving to the console and entering a series of commands. The freighter's lights dimmed as the stealth systems powered up, preparing the ship for its role in humanity's last, desperate gambit. Above Arc Centauri, the air shimmered faintly, the first signs of the hidden fleet emerging from the void. Washington's voice, though silenced on the gallows, resonated in the hearts of those who had heard it, a call to arms that could not be ignored. And as the Arbiter declared the execution complete, its voice hollow and strained, the galaxy began to change. The rope had snapped taut, and the crowd, for a moment, was silent. The scene froze, as though even the universe itself hesitated to process what had just occurred. General Washington's lifeless body hung from the gallows, the defiance etched on his face, now locked in time. The Arbiter stood motionless, its clawed hands resting on the podium, waiting for the waves of submission to ripple across the galaxy. But what followed was not submission. Far above the Capitol, a ripple distorted the sky. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but then it grew, spreading outward like a crack through glass. The air shimmered, and from the void emerged a fleet of human stealth ships, their hulls absorbing and bending light to remain near invisible until the perfect moment. For the briefest heartbeat, the Arbiter's eyes narrowed, confusion flashing across its alien features. Then the realization struck. It raised an arm to issue commands, but it was already too late. The lead ship broke formation first, a sleek predator among a pack of wolves. Its name, Wrath, was emblazoned in stark letters across its hull. From its underbelly, a pulse of blinding energy erupted, a weapon unlike anything the Empire had ever seen. The pulse surged downward, striking one of the spires in the heart of the Capitol. The structure crumbled in on itself, sending shards of metal and glass raining onto the plaza below. The crowd screamed, their jeers turning to chaos as they scattered in every direction. The alien executioner released a lever and backed away from Washington's body, its mandibles clicking nervously. The Arbiter barked orders, its voice amplified through the plaza, but the commands were drowned out by the roar of engines and the deafening blast of human weaponry. Among the chaos, the human slave station at the edges of the plaza began to stir. Chains clattered to the ground as hidden tools, passed secretly from hand to hand, cut through their restraints. A gaunt man with silvered hair, one of the slaves Washington had locked eyes with moments before his death, rose to his full height. His name was Arthur Morrow, a former soldier turned laborer, and though his body bore the scars of years of oppression, his spirit burned bright. "Now," Morrow shouted, his voice cutting through the din for Washington, "for humanity." He grabbed the fallen overseer's weapon, a crude but effective shock staff, and drove it into the chest of another alien guard. Around him, the other slaves followed his lead, their initial hesitation melting away as the realization dawned. The rebellion Washington had spoken of wasn't some distant dream. It was here, and it was now. Across the galaxy, similar scenes unfolded. On Veda's prime, the reptilian labor with the golden eyes smashed its chains against the ground, shattering them in a single, powerful motion. It turned to the overseer, who cowered before the towering figure and roared, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the jungle. In Titan's Gulch, the young miner with the pickaxe swung it with precision, striking down the alien foreman who had tormented her and her peers for years. The other miners rallied behind her, their makeshift tools raised high as they surged toward the gates of their prison. On the bridge of the Wrath, Captain Elias Trent stood with his arms crossed, his expression grim but determined. The ship's tactical officer, a wiry man named Callum Vance, shouted over the noise of alarms and weapon fire. "Fleet reports enemy response incoming. They're mobilizing fast." "Let them," Trent said, his voice cold and unyielding. He turned to the communications officer, a quiet man with piercing blue eyes named Jonah Clark. "Broadcast a message. All frequencies." Clark nodded, his hands flying across the console. A moment later, Washington's voice filled the air once more, not as a live broadcast, but as a recording, his final speech, played again and again for all to hear. "To those enslaved, those oppressed, I say this. Rise." The words were a beacon, cutting through the noise of battle and the despair of oppression. Ships across the human fleet broadcast the message, amplifying it to reach as far as their systems allowed. On every enslaved world, in every labor camp, Washington's voice became a rallying cry, his defiance a weapon as potent as any fleet. The Arbiter watched from the gallows as the plaza descended into chaos. Its clawed hands trembled, its composure slipping as the tide turned before its very eyes. It barked commands into its communicator, demanding reinforcements, but the responses were scattered and confused. "Sir, human forces are targeting our central command spire," came one frantic reply. "They're disabling our communications grid, then reroute through the auxiliary." Another explosion rocked the plaza, cutting the Arbiter off mid-sentence. A massive, hulking transport ship descended through the smoke-filled sky, its landing thrusters kicking up a storm of dust and debris. The side hatch opened, and a squad of human soldiers poured out, their weapons blazing. Arthur Morrow fought his way to the gallows, his shock staff crackling as he cleared a path. He reached Washington's body, his chest heaving from exertion, and carefully cut the rope. Washington's lifeless form collapsed into his arms, heavy and unyielding, but Morrow held him as though he were a fallen king. He kept his word, Morrow whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He said we'd rise, and now we will. Behind him, the soldiers from the transport secured the plaza, their precise movements betraying years of training. One of them, a grizzled veteran named Donovan Holt, approached Morrow. "Is it done?" Holt asked, his voice low but steady. Morrow nodded. "It's done. But this is just the beginning." Holt glanced upward as the raft and its fleet continued their assault, targeting key Imperial infrastructure with surgical precision. "We'll make sure it's a beginning worth fighting for." The Arbiter, cornered and furious, attempted one last act of defiance. It raised its weapon, aiming it at the nearest human soldier, but before it could fire, Morrow stepped forward. "This is for Washington," he said, his voice filled with quiet fury. He drove the shock staff into the Arbiter's chest, the weapon crackling as the alien crumpled to the ground. Above, the human fleet began to withdraw, their mission accomplished. The Empire's hold on Arc Centauri was broken, its capital now a symbol not of dominance, but of resistance. And as the twin suns began to set, their light casting long shadows over the ruined plaza, Washington's voice echoed one final time across the galaxy, carried on the waves of rebellion he had ignited. "Rise." The fleet of human stealth ships soared through the heavens, their sleek forms cutting through the remnants of smoke and fire that shrouded Arc Centauri. From above, the once imposing galactic capital looked fractured and vulnerable, a far cry from the fortress it had always claimed to be. But the battle was far from over. Across the galaxy, the echoes of rebellion grew louder, and the Empire's forces scrambled to respond. On the bridge of the raft, Captain Elias Trent stood before the wide observation window, his face illuminated by the glow of distant fires. He gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white, as the ship's tactical systems chirped incessantly. Reports of enemy reinforcements flooded in, each more dire than the last, but his focus remained steady. "Status?" Trent demanded, his voice sharp but calm. Callum Vance glanced up from his terminal, his expression grim. "Multiple Imperial fleets are converging on our position. The comm channels are a mess, our signals being jammed in half the sectors. But the message, it's spreading, sir. Rebellions are breaking out across 17 systems. 18 if we count the mining colonies on Zephyr 4. Trent allowed himself a small, fleeting smile. Then Washington's sacrifice wasn't in vain. At the far end of the bridge, Lieutenant Marcus Hales worked furiously at his station, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked up, his voice urgent. "Sir, we've got incoming. 3 Imperial destroyers just dropped out of hyperspace. They're locking weapons." The ship shuddered violently as the first barrage struck, jolting everyone on board. Sparks rained from an overloaded console, and alarms blared through the corridors. Trent barked orders, his calm demeanor giving way to the fire of a battlefield commander. "All hands, brace for impact. Return fire. Target their weapon systems and disable them. We need to buy the rest of the fleet time to fall back." As the raft weaved through the chaos, its cannons roared to life, unleashing a torrent of energy that sliced through the nearest destroyer's defenses. The enemy's ship shuddered, its shields collapsing under the relentless assault. But the 2 remaining destroyers closed in, their combined firepower overwhelming. In the middle of the fray, Jonah Clark, the communications officer, called out, "Captain, we're receiving a priority transmission. It's from one of the other ships in the fleet, the Redemption. They're asking for permission to engage the flagship directly." Trent's jaw tightened. He knew what that meant. The Redemption was an older vessel, slower and less equipped for sustained combat. A direct assault would be suicide. "Tell them to hold position," he said. "We'll—" "Sir, they've already gone dark," Clark interrupted. His voice wavered, but his hands remained steady. Through the observation window, the crew watched as the Redemption broke formation and charged straight toward the largest Imperial destroyer. Its engines burned bright, pushing the ship to its limits. The crew of the raft held their breath as the smaller vessel plowed through enemy fire, its hull crumbling under the relentless assault. And then, in a blinding flash, the Redemption rammed into the destroyer's command deck, detonating its core. The explosion rippled outward, consuming both ships in a fiery blaze. For a moment, the battlefield fell silent, the sheer audacity of the act stunning friend and foe alike. Trent exhaled slowly, his chest tightening. "They knew what they were doing," he said, his voice quieter now. "They gave us a chance." Around him, the crew returned to their tasks, their resolve hardened. The raft pressed forward, leading the remaining fleet in a coordinated retreat. But as they navigated through the chaos, another signal broke through the static. A voice, faint but unmistakable. "This is Arthur Morrow," it said. "The capital is secure." Repeat, "The capital is secure." On the surface, Morrow stood amidst the wreckage of the plaza, his body battered but unbroken. Around him, human soldiers and freed slaves worked together to secure the area, their movements quick and efficient. The Arbiter's corpse lay crumpled near the gallows, a grim reminder of the price of tyranny. Morrow turned to Donovan Holt, who was coordinating with other squads via a portable comm unit. "What's the situation?" "Resistance is scattered," Holt replied. "Most of the Empire's forces are pulling back to regroup. We've secured the Central Command spire, and Washington's message is still broadcasting across the grid." Morrow nodded, his gaze drifting to the gallows. Washington's body had been carefully laid on a makeshift stretcher, covered with a tattered flag bearing the insignia of humanity's old alliance. "He did it," Morrow said quietly. "Even in death, he did it." Above them, the sky shifted once more as the human fleet executed its final maneuver. The remaining stealth ships fired one last volley, targeting key installations across the capital. Explosions dotted the skyline, toppling the Empire's symbols of dominance one by one. And then, as quickly as they had arrived, the ships vanished, retreating into the depths of space. The raft led the charge, its hull scarred but its crew unbroken. On board, Trent stood in the center of the bridge, his eyes scanning the tactical displays. He felt the weight of every life lost, every sacrifice made, pressing down on his shoulders. But he also felt something else. Hope. "This isn't the end," he said, addressing the crew. "It's the beginning." Washington lit the spark, and now it's up to us to keep it burning. Hales, standing nearby, nodded solemnly. "We'll make sure his death meant something." As the ship disappeared into hyperspace, the galaxy began to shift. The Empire, once thought invincible, now faced a threat it could no longer ignore. And for the first time in generations, the oppressed, human and alien alike, saw a glimmer of freedom on the horizon. Back on Arc Centauri, Morrow stood atop the remains of the gallows, his voice echoing across the plaza. "Today, we take back what they stole from us," he declared. "Not just our freedom, but our future. For Washington, for humanity, for every life they tried to break." The crowd roared in response, their voices rising as one. And as the twin suns set over the ruined capital, their light bathed the plaza in a golden glow, illuminating a galaxy on the brink of revolution.